Hello and welcome back to Sociology 101. I had some time today before I needed to head home, so I thought I would jump on here and respond to a video I have had in the query to respond to for a long time. It's a famous clip by R.C. Sproul where he asked the question, what is wrong with you people? After being asked maybe a question that reflected the audience and its reaction to the punishment that God inflicts upon humanity. And the question will become more clear as we play this clip. Before we jump into it, I do want to make a few regular announcements, if you will, for those that are just tuning in for the very first time. Go to sociology101.com if you haven't. Click on the classroom link to learn more about Trinity Seminary, where you can get a higher theological education. Click on the support link if you can support us. We appreciate so much our patrons who give to make this broadcast possible. And as seen there scrolling at the bottom of the screen, you can download our app and leave a 5-star review, share this video, click on the subscribe link, click on the button that says, the little bell that says, hey, we're on, because you guys never know when I'm going to get on, and I don't either most of the time. It's just during the spare time that I have during the day. And so if you want a notification about us being on, then you can click that bell, and YouTube and Facebook and everywhere else will tell you. So I appreciate so much those who share the videos, who like the videos, who tell people about it. I also want to bring to your attention, if you go to sociology101.com and click on the About Us page and you look at my bio, there underneath my bio is a form that you can fill out, a speaker request form if you want me to come to your church to speak on various topics. And so you can fill that out if you have any interest in that as well. So without any further ado, I want to play this clip from R.C. Sproul asking the question, what is wrong with you people? Many of you are very familiar with, memes have been made about this, and he really gets on to the folks for the question that they ask, and I think it makes sense once you hear it. Let's listen. Let me know sound is okay here.
If God is slow to anger and patient, since God is slow to anger, we're always learning. Since God is slow to anger and patient, then why, when man first sinned, was his wrath and punishment so severe and long-lasting?
Time out. Didn't we just have that question a second ago?
We did.
Yeah,
it's a little
did.
nuance.
That God's punishment for Adam was so severe. This creature from the dirt defied the everlasting holy God. After that, God had said, the day that you shall eat of it, you shall surely die. And instead of dying, Thanatos, that day, he lived another day and was clothed in his nakedness by pure grace and had the consequences of a curse applied for quite some time. But the worst curse would come upon the one who seduced him, whose head would be crushed by the seed of the woman. And the punishment was too severe? What's wrong with you people? I'm serious. I mean, this is what's wrong with the Christian church today. We don't know who God is, and we don't know who we are. The question is, why wasn't it infinitely more severe? If we have any understanding of our sin and any understanding of who God is, that's the question, isn't it?
Okay, now you can see why I might want to play that video and why that's an important discussion point, so to speak, when it comes to a Calvinist making that kind of rebuke towards people asking the question, why was God's punishment so severe? And given the fact that we have from R.C. Sproul and other leading Calvinists, including John Calvin himself, saying that even, yes, the fall, Adam's choice to sin, was in accordance with what God has decreed for him to do. In other words, it didn't happen by accident. It didn't happen by a libertarian freedom act of the will, according to the consistent Calvinist at least. And therefore, the reason that Adam ate from the tree is because God deemed that he would, as Calvin put it. In other words, it was decreed, i.e. sovereignly and unchangeably brought to pass by God's sovereign decree on Calvinism. And therefore, when you even ask the question, what's wrong with you people? The answer on Calvinism is God's decree is what's wrong with these people. They are doing exactly what God has decreed for them to do and to be. The question that was asked was sovereignly and unchangeably decreed by God, brought about by God, unchangeably brought about by God. And yet, you've got R.C. Sproul, while on one hand saying God sovereignly and unchangeably decrees all things, even the question that I'm about to rebuke, and at the same time, bringing a rational rebuke of the very question that the person was sovereignly ordained to ask. Because when you begin to understand what Calvinism is, i.e. theological determinism, theistic determinism, where all things are determined by the Creator God, not that he sees and knows what people will choose to do and allows that to happen, that is explicitly denied in their confessions. God knows it because he decreed it. That's even another quote we've played from Sproul in other broadcasts. The reason he knows what Adam and Eve will do is because he decreed what Adam and Eve will do. The reason he knows what the rapist and the molester and the murderer will do is because he decreed what the molester, rapist, and murderer will do. And again, these are not new quotes. We've brought them up thousands of times before. We've looked at them before on other broadcasts, and you can look at them for yourself. Institutes of the Christian Religion, you can read them for yourself. The will of God is not only free from fault, but the highest rule of perfection. I admit that it's a miserable condition wherein men are now bound. All of Adam's children have fallen by God's will. With Augustine, I say the Lord has created those whom he will unquestionably foreknew would go to destruction. This happened because he has willed it. So he just didn't foreknow it, he willed it. Individuals are born who are doomed from the womb to certain death and are to glorify him by their destruction. It is vain to debate about prescience or foreknowledge, when it's clear that all events take place by his sovereign appointment. But since he foresees future events only by reason of the fact that he decreed that they should take place, they vainly raise quarrel over foreknowledge when it is clear that all things take place rather by his determination and bidding. Here it is. Again, I ask, whence does it happen that Adam's fall irremediably involves so many peoples together with their infant offspring in eternal death, unless because it so pleased God? The decree is dreadful indeed, I confess. Yet no one can deny that God foreknew what end man would have before he created him, and consequently foreknew because he so ordained by his decree. Which, by the way, this is exactly the argument that I heard Doug Wilson making in his debate last night with Kurt Jaros, which, by the way, Dr. Jaros did a really good job, I think, picking apart. You guys think that I do a lot of stories and a lot of analogies. Go listen to the Wilson debate and see how many stories and analogies that man uses. I have no qualm with people using stories and analogies, but man, he jumped from one analogy and example to another one, mixing categories all along the way. And maybe we can have Dr. Jaros on if he wants to come and talk through some of those things, because it was quite entertaining, but at the same time quite revealing as to the quandary of determinism as reflected by at least Doug Wilson from what I saw. Calvin goes on to say, and it ought not to seem absurd for me to say that God not only foresaw the fall of the first man, and in him the ruin of his descendants, but also meted it out in accordance with his own decision. In other words, it was God's choice for what Adam would choose. Any wonder somebody in the audience might say, that seems a little harsh for God to do what he does to Adam and Eve, since, after all, God sovereignly and unchangeably meted it out according to his own decision what Adam and Eve would do. Seems a little strange, doesn't it? And we could go on and on and on. Man's fall according to God's providence ordains, but he falls by his own fault. In other words, we want to have our cake and eat it too here. We're going to say God is the one who did it. God is the one who ordained it. God is the one who decreed it. God is the one who determined it. But he's going to hold men to fault for what he has sovereignly and unchangeably decided for them to do. The first man fell because the Lord deemed it meet that he should. John Calvin, Institutes of Christian Religion, right there in front of you, black and white. Okay? So do you understand why this question is so vital when dealing with Calvinists and Calvinism as a whole? Because the question is basically this: why in the world is God blaming man for what he sovereignly and unchangeably determined for them to do, and they could not have done otherwise? Why would God do that? What's the purpose? Is that just? Is that right? Is it good for God to do these things? And is it what the Bible reveals, more importantly, that he's doing? Is it like C.S. Lewis says, that this concept of total inability makes God into a omnipotent or all-powerful demon that we would worship? Yes, he's good, but we don't know how he's good. We just worship we know not what, because his good is not our good and his bad is not our bad. And so we just say, yeah, he's worthy of worship, but we don't know why, because it doesn't seem like anything's good or right whenever he's ultimately determining providentially everything we think, say, and do. How in the world is the blameworthiness of the creature established on a theistic determinism framework? That is the question for the debate. That is the issue that's continually being raised over and over again, is what about the blameworthiness of the creature? What about the responsibility of the creature? Now, many people get the false impression that we are trying to make men out to be not as bad as they really are. And that's the way the debate is often framed as, you provisionists, you Arminians, you non-Calvinists over there, you're trying to make out men, lost humanity, to be better than they really are. And we Calvinists, we're trying to help people to understand how really horrible and bad they are. And I would argue that just the opposite is the case. Now, I understand when I was a Calvinist, I used to think I was doing the same thing. I used to think you poor Arminians over there, you people just don't quite get it because you don't realize how bad the fall was. You don't realize how horrible we as sinners really were. We're so dead and depraved and incapable, and you just don't get that yet. And until you get that, you're going to give man this ability to make choices, and you're just worshiping in the idol of free will, and you're just all about making men better and bigger than they really are. That's the mindset I had as a Calvinist. But after studying a little bit on this topic and reading, actually, believe it or not, the first 400 years of the Christian church fighting against Gnostics, I began to realize the argument's just the opposite. It's true, actually, that when you maintain the blameworthiness of the sinner by recognizing they have responsibility, they have the ability to respond to God even in that lost condition, that's what makes them so blameworthy. Because look at this objectively. Back away from your system long enough to understand this objectively, Calvinists, and really hear it when I say it. Which is worse? The person who was born hated by God, who therefore hates God, or the person who was born loved by God and then chooses freely to hate God? Let me say that again and just answer objectively. Back away from your system. Pretend that neither system exists. Just be asked this question. Just answer the question objectively. Which is worse? The person born hated and rejected by God, not provided for. Jesus did not die for them. God did not want them. God created them for destruction. God created them for wrath. God hated them from birth, and therefore that man hated God. That person, or the person who is loved by God, he's born loved by God, he's born provided for by God, and that person freely, though he could have done otherwise, chooses to reject and hate that God. Which one of those two men is worse? We, provisionists, Arminians, non-Calvinists, we are defending the justice and the righteousness of God, and we are maintaining the blameworthiness of the sinner who rejects the gospel. Lost sinners are far worse on our worldview than on the Calvinistic worldview, because for all practical purposes, people are born victims under Calvinism. They're born victims of God's decree. Either they're born elect or they're born reprobate. Either they're born doomed from the womb or they're born unto certain salvation. They're victims. In other words, they were born that way and they could not have done anything else about that. Where is the blameworthiness on that person who was born ultimately judged for things that are completely beyond his control? And again, these aren't arguments new to me. Go read the first 400 years of the Christian church fighting against the Gnostics, determinists of their worldview. The determinists of the first 4 centuries were the Gnostics and the Manichaeans and the Stoics. Go listen to Polycarp. Go listen to Irenaeus. Go listen to Ignatius. Go read them. They make all these arguments much better than I could make them in the first 4 centuries. This is not a new argument. Heresies and false teachings and false doctrines and false ideas and false philosophies tend to repeat themselves. History repeats itself, and it's all being regurgitated and repeated once again in the rise of Calvinism here in the United States today, with the rise of the Young Restless Reform movement, the new Calvinist Reform movement. Thanks for the super chat, by the way. By the way, I am not going to even try to pronounce your name, brother. I'll put it up there on the screen and say thank you for your donation, but I can't even begin to way too many syllables for me there, my friend. But I do appreciate the super chat donation. Okay, I want to unpack this with an article, and we won't keep this one. We'll keep this one bite-sized. But I want you to really hear this truth, because it really has to do with the blameworthiness of the sinner. That's what we're defending here. That's what we're really trying to dive deep into, is to understand that we are not trying to exalt man. We are trying to bring men to their right place in light of the Scripture. In other words, we're not trying to exalt man by saying that they have something that they don't really have. We're trying to say that people are culpable and responsible for good reason, and God is just in condemning them. And so this may help when you see this article. Let me add it to the screen here, and that way you can see it. I'll make it a little smaller. I think that's big enough, don't you think? Here we go. Let's look at it. I was recently accused of worshiping the idol of human autonomy. Have those who bring this kind of harsh accusation really unpacked the meaning of these terms, or sought to understand our intentions? I suspect most have not. Webster's defines autonomous simply as undertaken or carried on without outside control. You understand what autonomous means? When we say autonomous, we're not saying we exist autonomously from God. Okay? My next breath is a gift from God. My heartbeat is in His hands. Okay? We don't exist autonomously from God. But when we're talking about autonomous, we're talking about the will of man, the will to do what's wrong, the will to act outside of God's purposes and His plan is autonomous. In other words, it's being carried out without His control. He is not ultimately determining what I will choose to do. He is not choosing my choices for me. He is granted in His sovereign right as king to allow for me to make my own determinations. As A.W. Tozer, I think, eloquently put it, God did not decree which choice we'll make, but we would be free to make it. And that a God less than sovereign would be afraid to give His creatures that much freedom because He wouldn't be able to handle it. A true sovereign God is able to bring about His purposes and His plans, even with free creatures, libertarianly free creatures doing all kinds of different things. God's big enough to handle it, okay? On Calvinism, the only way God can accomplish His purpose is by controlling everything and everyone. And what we say is, no, God can bring about His purposes despite the fact that He's not controlling everyone and everything, because He's a lot bigger God than you think He is. And so Webster's defines autonomous simply as undertaken or carried on without outside control. The term autonomous describes things that function separately, and I highlight that word because it's used in other conversations with Calvinists that is important. So keep that word in mind, separately. That's what autonomous is, separate, okay? Or independently. For instance, once you move out of your parents' house and get your own job, you will be an autonomous member of the family. This adjective, autonomous, is often used of countries or regions or groups that have right to govern themselves. Autonomous is from Greek, autonomous, independent from autos, self, plus nomos, law. Okay, and there's a link there, it goes into more detail on the original. Okay, some wrongly assume that my use of this term is meant to suggest that mankind's existence, sustenance, and natural abilities are independent of God altogether. This is absurd, of course, as I've already mentioned. Paul asked his readers, what do you have that you did not receive? 1 Corinthians 4:7, which strongly implies that all our abilities, including the ability to make free choices, that is given to us by a good and gracious God. My ability to reason, my ability to think, as Dr. Tim Stratton says, my ability to think about my thoughts, to think about my choices in the past, to be guilty, to have a conscience, all of those things, these are gracious gifts given to us by our Creator who made us in His image. So we can affirm that God is in heaven and He does whatever pleases Him, Psalm 115:3. While still holding to the equally valid truth that the highest heavens belong to the Lord, but the earth He has given to mankind, in verse 16 of that same chapter. This means it pleases God to give man a certain level of autonomy, separateness, dominion. This is a biblical view of divine sovereignty and autonomy. As A.W. Tozer, as I just mentioned, rightly explains, God sovereignly decreed that man should be free to exercise moral choice. And man from the beginning has fulfilled that decree by making his choice between good and evil. When he chooses to do evil, he does not thereby countervail the sovereign will of God, but fulfills it, inasmuch as the eternal decree decided not which choice the man should make, but that he should be free to make it. If in his absolute freedom God has willed to give man limited freedom, who is there to stay his hand or say, "Why dost thou?" Man is free because God is sovereign. A God less than sovereign could not bestow moral freedom upon his creatures. He would be afraid to do so. Again, from A.W. Tozer. Some Calvinists have wrongly concluded that the traditionalist or the provisionist, like myself, seek to downplay the sovereignty of God and highlight the autonomy of man, when in reality we seek to maintain the right biblical understanding of man's autonomy so as to better highlight the sovereignty, love, and holiness of our God. Eamon, thank you for your super chat. He asked the question if I've managed to contact Derek Webb or Megan Phelps. Many of you recognize, especially if you've watched our short videos that Eric has been putting out recently, Caleb has been putting out our short videos recently. And one of them was on Derek Webb and Megan Phelps, both of them who have left Christian faith altogether because of Calvinistic beliefs. At least that's according to their testimony. And no, I've not had any luck with either one of them. If anybody has any contact with either one of them that would help them to get on the show, I would love to interview them, and that would be a great thing to do. I go on to write, I say, I have already unpacked the attributes of God's sovereignty, and you can click on the links there if you're interested in that. His love. I would now like to turn to attention to the attribute of God's holiness. If you notice that the Tozer quote above is from his book, The Knowledge of the Holy, Tozer's intentions, like that of the traditionalist or the provisionist or the Arminian, I would even include, it's in defense of God's holiness. It's not an attempt to undermine other equally important attributes of our good and righteous God. I suspect that Tozer, like myself, would wholeheartedly agree with John Piper's teaching on God's holiness here. Quote, every effort to define the holiness of God ultimately winds up by saying God is holy means God is God. Let me illustrate. The root meaning of holy is probably to cut or to separate. Do y'all remember the word separate from earlier? Is the definition of the word autonomous? That's what separate is, autonomous, separate. A holy thing is cut off and separated from common. We would say secular use. Earthly things and persons are holy. They are distinct from the world and devoted to God. So the Bible speaks of holy ground, holy assemblies, holy Sabbath, a holy nation, holy garments, a holy city, holy promises, holy men and women, scriptures, holy hands, holy kiss, and holy faith. Almost anything can be holy if it is separated, there's the word again, separated from the common and devoted to God. But notice what happens when this definition is applied to God himself, Piper continues. From what can you separate God to make him holy? The very godness of God means that he is separate from all that is not God. Okay, so here's the question, not God right here. This is really important. There's a separate from that is which is God, from that is which is not God. There's a separation between those two. Believe it or not, and I'm going to illustrate this as we go through this, believe it or not, whether you understand this or not, that is what our emphasis is when we're talking about the free will of man. We're not bowing at the idol of free will. We are talking about this exact point that Piper is talking about here when talking about the holiness of God. That which is of God and that which is not of God. That which, as Kirk Juros rightly said in the debate with Doug Wilson last night, there are certain things God determines. What are those things? Those things are of God. There's other things that God does not determine, but that Satan determines. Those things would be of Satan. There's certain things that Adam and Eve determine. Those things would be of man. There's certain things that you determine. Those things would be of you, not of God. Do you see the difference? That's why this is so important, okay? There is an infinite qualitative difference, Piper goes on to say, between the creator and creature. God is one of a kind, in a class by himself. In that sense, he is utterly holy, but then you have said no more than he is God, end quote, from John Piper. Now notice the common use to describe God's holiness and man's autonomy. The word separate is referenced in both definitions. Now this is significant. Some Calvinists fail to see that the traditionalist or the provisionist, depending on what term, this was written back when I was still using traditionalism as our main label. I like the word provisionism better now, okay? God's provision for all people. So the provisionist defense of man's separateness, his autonomy, is actually in defense of God's holiness. Or as Piper put it, God's separateness from all that is not God. Remember what we said earlier? From all that is not God. But in a world of divine meticulous control of all things, what is left to be considered separate in any meaningful sense of the word? And this is what I think Doug Wilson kept missing last night in the debate with Kurt, is that there is nothing that's really separate in a world of meticulous divine determinism. Not ultimately, because everything is written by Shakespeare. If you heard the debate, you know what I'm talking about. Everything is written by the author of that which happens in the play. One would think that sinful intentions would be included in all that is not God. Yet many Calvinistic scholars affirm that man's sinful intentions are unchangeably predetermined or brought about by God so as to glorify himself. There's a link there for you to see that for yourself. We must understand that John Piper, while holding to the same definition of holiness as Tozer or myself as a provisionist, comes to a very different conclusion about the nature of our thrice holy God. Continuing with the quote above, Piper concludes, quote, "If the holiness of a man derives from being separated from the world and devoted to God, to whom is God devoted so as to derive his holiness? To no one but himself," end quote. See, Piper here, in my estimation, fails to relate his understanding of God's holiness, his separateness, to the nature of morally accountable creatures as autonomously separate, but instead uses this attribute to emphasize his Calvinistic view of God's self-seeking nature. Piper is arguing that God is all about himself because there is no higher reality than God to which he must conform in order to be holy. In other words, God is all about God because there is nothing more holy than God. But what does this even mean unless you establish that which God has separated himself from in the meticulously determined world of Piper's Calvinism? How can one celebrate God being about God unless you understand, unless you grasp, and unless you separate that which is not about God from that which is about God? What exactly can be deemed as, quote, separated in a world where absolutely everything is brought about by God for God? Holiness loses its meaning in a deterministic worldview because nothing can be described in any significant way as, quote, separate from God and his will. It is senseless to speak of God's holiness as separateness unless there is something outside of God from which to separate. God cannot be separated from himself or his own decrees or choices or decisions. Can he? If he can, what rational meaning does that have? Think about this. And if you insist on the one hand that God is unchangeably determining all creatures' sinful inclinations so as to glorify himself, then how can you on the other hand claim that God is wholly separate from those same sinful yet self-glorifying means? You might as well be claiming A is not A. God is separate but not separate. He's holy but not holy in the same way we just defined holiness. It's contradiction after contradiction. It's irrational. It's untenable. Listen, either God is implicated in moral evil or he's not. He is either holy or he is not. He is either separate, an affirmation of both divine holiness and human autonomy, by the way, or he is not, a denial of both divine holiness and human autonomy. Do not allow the Calvinists to have their cake and eat it too on this point. John Piper takes the attribute of holiness to teach that, quote, God is all about himself, end quote, whereas Tozer takes that same attribute of holiness to teach that while God would be perfectly just to be all about himself and his own glorification, instead he graciously chooses to glorify undeserving creatures who have separated themselves from him through autonomously sinful choices. Are you following that? So Tozer is agreeing that, yeah, God would be perfectly just and right to be all about himself. But the point of the cross is that God chooses graciously to be about us, to be about making himself a servant for unworthy vessels, which makes him all the more glorious indeed. Provisionist traditionalists like myself simply believe that Tozer is right and John Piper is woefully wrong. And you can go on to read more there at Soteriology 101 on that article if you're interested in it. Hopefully you understand where we're coming from now. Hopefully you hear the importance of this discussion and this distinction between what is true, what is right, what is of God, and what is not of God. I wrote this book called The Potter's Promise. I wrote this book called God's Provision for All. a defense of God's goodness. These books are of latent flowers, not of God. God didn't sovereignly and unchangeably decree my writing of these books. Now, I believe they're true, but I don't believe they're inspired by God. I believe I wrote them, okay? These are of latent. But the Bible, which is out of my reach right there, the Bible, sitting right there on the corner, that's of God. So what's the difference between the Bible and these books? These are of latent, that is of God, okay? Now, John Piper has many books, much more than I ever hoped to have. MacArthur has many books. Sproul has many books. All Calvinists have a lot of books, and they think they're true. They think they're right, of course. They wouldn't have written them if they didn't. But are they of God? Well, according to Calvinist claims, all things were sovereignly and unchangeably brought about by God, which would include their books. So on what basis are you claiming that the Bible is more authoritative than your book? Because both of them, on your view, were sovereignly and unchangeably brought about by God, and both of them are true. Otherwise, you wouldn't have wrote your book if you don't think they're true. So on what basis do you call one of them of God and one of them not of God? You can't, because ultimately, on determinism, everything is ultimately back onto God, from God. This is one of the reasons determinism does not hold. Kirk Jerris was making the right point over and over and over again. God does determine some things. For example, he determined to write the scriptures. He determined to bring his son Jesus to the cross. He determined Calvary. But proof that God determined for Joseph to be sold into slavery, for Pharaoh to be hardened, he determines some things throughout the course of human history to ensure the Passover, to ensure the second Passover, to ensure the crucifixion. Doesn't prove that God determines absolutely everything that ever happens in all the world. Proof that God worked to bring about the redemption of sin doesn't prove that God worked to bring about all the sin that he sent Jesus to die to redeem. That's absurd and self-defeating. And this is one of the things we've got to continue to push back against from our Calvinistic friends who are adopting a philosophical worldview that is not founded, as far as I can tell, in the pages of Scripture. And we, as non-Calvinists, as non-determinists, as ones who don't accept the more Gnostic form that was introduced in the 5th century by Augustine of philosophical determinism, we're holding to a view either rightly in defense of God's glory, or God is determined for us to be wrong for his glory. Can't really get around that. Peter, thank you for your donation, as always. Peter makes donations on a regular basis, and I appreciate that very much. And we've got to continue to stand up to the Calvinists in love, with respect. That's how we're going to win this discussion, as being the kind of people who show love and respect to people who make mistakes. Because guess what? John Piper, R.C. Sproul, and others, they're making a mistake freely. In other words, they're making a mistake based upon their own choices and decisions. They're not making a mistake but by divine decree that they couldn't have helped and that God unchangeably caused them to do through, secondary means or something of that nature. They're making a mistake freely. They're well-intending, but they're making mistakes. However, if Calvinism is true, Leighton Flowers and A.W. Tozer and C.S. Lewis and David Allen and Adam Harwood and the host of other traditionalist and provisionistic scholars in our world today, we're all making mistakes by divine sovereign decree for the glory of God. So guess what, guys? Rest easy in this. Either we're right in standing in defense of God's glory, or God is determined for us to be wrong for his glory. Either way, I feel pretty good because we're all about God's glory. God bless. Help spread this word. Share this, like this, and subscribe. God bless. See you next time. Be good. Bye-bye.